And you're back here on Likeable Science here on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm Ethan Allen, your host of Likeable Science. Thank you for joining us again. Likeable Science is all about how science is a vital and interesting and dynamic part of everyone's life, and we all should learn to love and embrace science. We should not be scared of it. We should not isolate science away. We should learn to talk about science, and we'll be talking about science here today. With me today in the studio, I have two guests. I have Andrei Natarov, who is an assistant researcher at the International Pacific Research Center, which studies climate and particularly, I guess, human activity and how that impacts climate. They do observations, simulations, models, and we're going to be talking about some climate models. And Andrei got his doctorate in physical oceanography and scientific computing, both, I guess, from the University of Michigan. And he studies waves and hydrodynamic variables and how the ocean mixes inside of it. And he goes out on cruises to try to find the signatures of such ocean processes, right?
Right. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Glad you're here. With us today also is Elisha Wood Charlson. She's the communications project manager here at the Center for Microbial Oceanography Research and Education, CMOR. And she works sort of splits her time, I guess, between two different things with the science communications ohana and the helping the students in Seymour, right?
Yeah, so I do a couple of things. I try to provide a lot of science communication opportunities and training for graduate students and postdocs in Seymour, but then also work as the public relations officer for the Science Communicators Ohana. And I just wanted to introduce that real quick.
Sure, absolutely.
So the Science Communicators Ohana is a registered independent organization through Manoa, and it's mostly run by graduate students and postdocs, and we basically put on training and workshops for people on campus, and we also do some training and presentations outside of that as well. So I wanted to give you guys our information.
Which I think is on an image we have there, right?
Yep, if you put that up. Yeah, so there's our little tagline. It's a place to share science. And we have an email address, and the best way to follow us is actually through Facebook. We put a lot of information up about science communication resources, ongoing activities, and then, of course, all of our workshops. And some of our workshops coming up for fall of 2015 include improv for scientists. We've actually got some money through the university to bring in an improv specialist to get scientists kind of out of their comfort zone and used to a little bit of improv, which would be fun. We also, every semester, run an introduction to blogging basics. And that's partly because we also publish the SOEST blog, which is the School of Ocean, Earth, Science, and Technology. The graduate students have a blog focused on research and what it's like to be a graduate student there. And then finally, we have a Perfecting Your Pub Speech, which is basically an elevator pitch, which is what they call it in business. And we call it a pub speech in academia because graduate students and postdocs do most of their networking at the pub after conferences. So our tagline is let's practice talking science together, and I encourage anybody to find us on Facebook and send us a message if you're curious about what we do.
Super. Sounds like a great group, and I know I've gotten some of your students on before, and they're all good communicators, and I enjoy it, and I applaud you for doing that. And yes, it's very important to be able to share science in sort of non-threatening ways and accessible ways, and we're going to do some of that. My little attempt at this is always I do these science campfire stories now, right? So I used to work in a lab that studied reptile reproduction, and reptiles play lots of odd games with how they reproduce. We used to look at particularly one kind of gecko, the leopard geckos. They're a little bigger than the geckos that we see here, about maybe 8 inches long, sort of stocky-bodied animals. But they have a phenomenon called temperature-dependent sex determination. So the sex of the gecko is not determined by chromosomes, but rather by the temperature in which it's incubated. And with high temperatures leading to males, low temperatures leading to females. So my advisor, when I was doing this postdoc, would purposely incubate eggs right in between those two temperatures and see what would happen. And the geckos that came out were rather interesting. They appeared to be female, but apparently their brains had gotten masculinized. They thought they were male, and so they would stand around looking cute, apparently looking female, and males would approach them to breed, and they would respond aggressively like another male would respond to such a male. And so they weren't very successful at breeding, and you could see that rapidly these things wouldn't do well in the world. But this whole phenomenon of temperature-dependent sex determination has actually evolved, I think, 4 separate times in reptiles, and it actually ties to today's topic, because we're going to be talking about climate variability and climate change, which is influencing the temperatures of the ocean. And sea turtles are one of the groups that have temperature-dependent sex determination. So if we start changing the temperatures of the ocean, we potentially are going to profoundly alter the evolutionary history of sea turtles.
Right.
So, Andrei, let's start with some definitions, okay?
Okay.
So we all know weather is sort of short-term, climate's long-term. But take us a little further than that. What should we really know about that?
There is that's true that weather is a short-term condition of atmosphere mostly. Climate is a longer-term condition of the atmosphere and other parts of the Earth system, like surface of the ocean or other things. What we need to know is that there has been an interest in predicting weather and climate.
Sure.
Interest in predicting weather has much longer history. People were interested in predicting weather immediately in their environment and the next day or even the same day. While climate is a more recent, the interest in climate prediction is a more recent phenomenon. And when we talk about climate, we're not just talking about temperature. Probably the earliest large interest in climate prediction was when people were interested in what kind of winds blow over the ocean when they started navigating across Atlantic Ocean in the 15th century, 16th century, etc.
Sure, but it also makes clear differences to farmers to know, gee, is it going to be a wet spring, a dry spring, early spring, late spring?
Right. So it has
terms
always been of interest to farmers, and now it's even more of interest to all types of industries and businesses.
Indeed. And you can see, of course, we're all, want to know, although here on the islands it doesn't so much matter because we have sort of relentlessly good weather, but the daily weather clearly makes a tremendous impact on people's lives and what you're going to do that day, how you have to dress to prepare for it. But then climate seems sort of less accessible. There's not much you can do about climate other than, put on more clothes or take off more clothes or whatever. Whereas weather you can sort of quickly adjust to.
Right, and also climate is harder to remember. So especially if it's changing, it's easy to remember that there's winter and summer in some parts of the world, but it's harder to remember that it's been changing, for example, and that's why the attention to climate change is less so than to weather events.
Right. Before it was sort of just anecdotal stuff. Somebody would say, "Oh, my grandfather used to talk about hiking to school through 4 feet of snow, and now we don't see snow anymore," or whatever.
Exactly.
Yes. But now there's very good evidence. Yes, we are in the middle of experiencing some very significant shifts in climate.
Right. And this evidence has been available for a very long time,
Right.
and more people come to realize that it's real. It's not just some academic game they're playing.
So just a little aside, why do you suppose people seem so resistant to this, to believing in climate change or to believing that people have anything to do with it?
There are many reasons. I think the most important one is exactly that the climate is hard to remember, and people remember dramatic effects. Sometimes climate change, when people say the temperature is increasing, but the events that accompany, like the trend of rising temperature, are really cold events, like cold winters somewhere, etc. And that seems to kind of contradict the global warming paradigm.
Right.
While people should actually learn to distinguish between event-like things like weather and climate, which is a different thing.
Right, and so there is a great deal of variability, and we're gonna keep dealing with this issue of variability. And some of it is somewhat predictable. Again, in temperate zones, summer to winter variability in temperature is fairly predictable. It used to be in the tropics, a lot of tropical islands, wet season, dry season was quite predictable. Much less so now, I gather. But then there's this thing called ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and that represents a sort of a different kind of thing, right? That's sort of some of the inherent instability or inherent variability, right?
Right. Well, to avoid talking about variability and instability, first let's talk about something which is predictable and changing, like seasons or day and night. We perfectly understand why this is happening, because day and night change because the Earth turns different sides towards the sun. But ENSO, or El Nino Southern Oscillation thing, is more complicated because it's mostly forced internally by ocean-atmosphere interaction. And that's a very complicated mechanism. And it's very irregular in terms of its period. So there is a certain time scale associated with it, but it's not as regular as seasons.
Right, right. And that, again, the seasons have a fairly well understood predictability to them because of the tilt of the Earth. When southern hemisphere is facing the sun versus northern hemisphere facing the sun, blah,
Exactly.
blah, blah. But this is a very, you've got this huge fluid mass of the ocean that has different temperatures, has received different amounts of heat, stored it sort of in different ways in different places, and is now interacting with an atmosphere that, again, is being heated and cooled somewhat unpredictably, too.
Exactly.
So, yes, it all gets to be messy.
Both atmosphere and ocean are very messy, complicated systems.
Right. So you've done a nice thing in terms of showing how this might work in a really simple way, right? And I think we have a first diagram.
Oh, I just wanted to introduce a
There we
phenomenon
go.
which is kind of, when people try to explain El Nino, sometimes they start with a very complicated model, which I don't understand myself. And so I decided to use a much simpler one.
A circle.
Yeah, a circle, which represents a non-rotating planet. In fact,
Non-rotating, okay.
It's important that it's non-rotating, because if it rotated, it would be much more complicated. And the earthly El Nino would be easier to explain. And there's sunlight falling onto this planet.
From the
shown-
top there, right?
Yeah, at the top. So remember, it's a non-rotating planet. So it's always exposed towards the sun with the same side.
Okay.
So we're going to call this side the hot pole.
Right.
So unlike North and South Pole on Earth, this is going to be a hot pole on this planet. And let's first assume that this planet has no ocean, but only atmosphere, somewhat Earth-like. So it's going to receive a lot of heat at the hot pole, and atmosphere surface is going to get warmed up, and this heat will get communicated, communicated to the atmosphere, to adjacent layers of the atmosphere. So the air is going to get lighter or less dense and rise close to the hot pole. And if we could go to the next sketch now to show the emerging circulation pattern in this atmosphere. Here you can see the air rising, so these lines showing the air rising at the hot pole. And as the air is rising there, the atmosphere or the air in the lower layer gets sucked in towards the hot pole, and then it has to go somewhere. So it has to kind of move away from the hot pole in the upper layer. So we're assuming it's a very simple two-layer atmosphere.
Right.
So if we now go to the next sketch to show how it's likely to close this atmospheric circulation on this non-rotating planet, it's going to close on the opposite pole, which we're going to call the cold pole, just because of the symmetry consideration. So it's a very simple atmospheric circulation on this planet where surface winds are pretty much everywhere blowing towards the hot pole.
Right. This would be day in, day out, year round, more or less all the time.
Depending on how intense the circulation is. You could
Right.
have turbulence still occurring in this.
Right. This would
thing.
be
But
a very boring place to live, though.
well,
Right.
probably would still have weather, but climate would be boring.
Right.
Probably. Right. So, but now if we add ocean to this planet, so the next slide would add ocean and everything else that I need to talk about. So the ocean now is shown in this bluish color, except for the region underneath the hot pole, where in orange I show the warm pool, so it receives sun directly, and the water there is warmer and also less dense. So you have a kind of a density stratification. Initially, let's assume it's at the hot pole, so this orange water is there. So the planet is non-rotating, so this warm water tries to spread all the way around the planet in a thin layer of warm fluid. And if there were no wind on this atmosphere, that's probably what would happen.
Right. So this, essentially your atmosphere is going to do just the opposite of what your hydrosphere is going to do.
Right. So
Your water is going to circulate one way, the atmosphere.
in that sketch, the warm pool tries to spread over the planet,
Right.
but there is a wind blowing towards the hot pole, which tries to collect it back and
Right.
say, no, you cannot go there. And so that's a competition between two different drivers of the ocean circulation
Right.
there.
And so that's going to be actually a great point, because it's a very thought-provoking issue, that competition and the conflict between the two things. We're going to let people think about that and chew on that when we go to a first break here.
Right.
They're here with us on Likeable Science. Andrei Natarov, Elisha Wood Charlson are with me today in the studio. We're talking about climate models, and we're on Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen, and we'll be right back in about 1 minute.
Hi, Jay. My name's My name's Keith Bettinger.
I knew that.
And I'm the host of ThinkTech Asia.
I knew that too.
Here on ThinkTech.
Fabulous. You got a great show going, Keith.
Thank you very much. And for our viewers out there that are interested in ThinkTech Asia, it airs every Tuesday from 4 to 4:45, and it can be accessed online at thinktech.com.
Yeah, so what kind of guests you like?
Well, we have a number of guests from academia, from practitioners of international affairs. Sometimes we have military officials. Sometimes we have public officials on the show. And our goal, we try to talk about current issues in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia, all throughout the Asian realm in more depth than you would find in traditional mainstream
That's the
media.
difference, isn't it?
Exactly.
That you're reaching out beyond what ordinary news media would do.
Right.
And that's why we like you so much.
We're trying to provide a thinking person's perspective, an intelligent perspective on what's going on, and we're both sides of the story, or even when there's more than two sides, we try to cover every angle. And I think that's one of the big benefits that we provide here at ThinkTech. Is it's a really innovative source of educational programming for the people of Hawaii.
You're great, Keith. You are a great host. You got a great show going on. I watch it every week.
Thanks very much.
Why don't you guys watch it every week too, okay?
4:45 to 4 to 4:45 every Tuesday.
Okay, we're back here on Likeable Science, and thank you for joining us again. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. With me today in the ThinkTech studios are Elisha Wood Charlson and Andrei Natarov, both from various organizations at UH, and we're talking about climate models as well as science communication here. We were looking at one of Andrei's beautiful sketches where he was giving us a nice simple model of a non-rotating planet to help us understand this issue of variability and unpredictability in climate models. And maybe if we could pull that one up again. Yes, there we go. So here he's got his atmosphere shown in those outer layers, which is whipping up towards the hot pole in terms of the airflow, and then rising there and then falling back down around towards the cold pole at the bottom. While the ocean is doing, if I understand it, just sort of the reverse, because it's coming up, and as it flows in that same pattern, it's then in conflict with the winds.
Right. So there is a competition between density-driven ocean circulation and wind-driven ocean circulation.
Okay.
And there's equilibrium between them that can happen, or one of them can weaken due to a fluctuation or something or anything, and then the other one would win. So conditions when the wind is winning, pretty much, it's more like normal conditions on Earth, non-El Nino, non-La Nina conditions. And if for some reason the wind slackens or the warm pool gets spread a little bit by a perturbation, then we might get something similar to El Nino on Earth, where this warm pool would spread much further than it normally is. So it drives system out of equilibrium. So this is a simple model of a completely different climatic phenomenon, non-El Nino, because this is not Earth, but it has the same similar ingredients to what El Nino has on Earth. The differences are that the circulation on Earth is not necessarily driven by this convection. So the trade winds are forced mostly through a different mechanism into which we don't have time to go into. And there are, of course, other differences, but the essence is here.
No, and this is a beautiful example of why we use models, right? By taking out some of that complexity, by taking out some of the variables, you make it easier to understand what's going on here, right?
Right.
Your little toy model car doesn't have all the complexity of a car, doesn't have the engine and airbags and all these fancy things in it, but it's easy to sort of understand maybe some of the basics of how a car works, right?
Exactly. So in this case, we can build a model from scratch. We can draw a planet and start talking about circulation from the very beginning. On Earth, it would be a large detour to explain why the wind pattern, the mean wind pattern is such on Earth.
Right, in part because of the rotation, the tilt of the axis relative to the sun, the existence of the ocean being in different depths and little things like continents
all
being in
these
the way.
details which
right.
do not help explaining this conceptually, but extremely useful in incorporating in models that aim at actually predicting what's going to happen.
Right.
So that's a different type of a model.
Exactly, and those complexities get to be really, really remarkable. I recall being very struck when I first moved out here to Hawaii to think, here we've got this small island, and we all know, of course, we learned the simple model about tides, right? The tides are driven strictly by the moon and the sun and their position relative to Earth. And yet, if you look at the tide charts, different parts of this island have high and low tides at rather dramatically different times,
Right.
which, as I said, well, that they're not that different in terms of their distance from the sun and the moon. You know, why are they different? And it's because of very complex factors of the underlying geology, the shape of the island, the trenches, the currents. Right. So it's, yeah, again, a simple model can only take you so far.
Exactly, yes.
So, Elisha, you probably have to talk to your students, I'd imagine, about using models often, or get them to build models to help explain their work too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I work mostly on microbial oceanography, and so things that you can't see, which makes it a little bit different to kind of engage students and the general public in it. So oftentimes we do talk more in grand things in terms of like function and what the observed function that the microbes do. So for example, one of the most common microbes in the world is a little organism that lives out just north of here, all around the Pacific, around the islands, called Pleurococcus. And it's a photosynthetic microbe, and it actually is part of what contributes to half of the oxygen that we breathe every day. So trying to make linkages like that, like what Andrei's trying to make linkages of a non-rotating planet, which seems a little bit silly, but it helps you kind of conceptualize the importance of it.
Right.
We try to do the same thing with the microbes as well. So
exactly, that's a whole bunch of what is really fundamental to the process of science, is taking complex phenomena, looking at them, trying to tease out the central, most important factors and build a model that at least begins to explain the features, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay. And there are lots of different kinds of models, right? I mean, there are physical models, which we tend to think of. There are schematics. There are, and what you really deal with, Andrei, are mathematical models, right?
Right.
That probably frightens most of our viewers away.
hence the science communication.
Exactly. Everyone should like math, should do math. I saw a thing recently on taking the computation out of math. A beautiful TED talk, actually, on getting computation out of math, because that's the part the computers can do, so we don't need to deal with it.
Oh, interesting.
Really nice. So tell us a little bit about some of these models and that you use.
Oh, right. So the models kind of they can be arranged in terms of their complexity in a hierarchy, so to speak. So there are very simple models, and there are more complex models, and the more complex they become, the more useful at predicting things they're supposed to get. But interestingly, climate models, for example, for a very long time have not been used to make any predictions. They were used only to understand the dynamics of the climate system, and nobody was worrying about them not getting things right, etc. Until pretty much 80s, the climate models were not really used for prediction. But now we have coupled ocean atmosphere models, which are directed exactly at predicting what the climate is going to be, how the ENSO is going to unfold, and they're all differ from each other in terms of resolution and other things.
Sure, and all these models have these various sort of components, these parts you put in, and that will impact how the model reacts, how it plays out. And so things like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is obviously an important piece of that, right?
Right.
And
it also depends what you're trying to predict with the model. So there are these IPCC models which are used to project how climate is going to be in response to CO2 emissions, different scenarios, different time frames, short term, 35 years, or longer term, 100 years from now. And so there's a very well-defined driving force in these models, CO2 increase. So maybe they're not going to get details of regional circulation of atmosphere ocean, right? Because you're kind of neglecting a lot of things that might be different in the future. Or if you're interested in predicting El Nino, then you have to use a completely different type of model, probably with higher resolution in the tropics, and not worry about how CO2 is going to increase over the next few years.
Right.
So that's different objectives require different models.
Exactly. You have a whole slew of factors, and you really can't probably plug them all in. And any model uses some subset of them, depending upon what you want to get out of your model.
Right.
Yeah, and putting in all the variables in a model that may or may not have the same level of dynamics. You might change something and nothing really changes in the model, where you have certain other components that if you fluctuate those a little bit, it might have a downstream cascade where you have massive changes in the model. So picking your models carefully is probably the hardest
Right.
part.
And what you're talking about is the topic of sensitivity of models to different things. So models can be sensitive to some variables and not sensitive to other variables. For example, climate IPCC models are not very sensitive to the fact that you included orbital forcing, for example, on a scale of a few tens of thousands of years, because they're not very important over such a scale.
But the relationship, say, between water vapor and CO2, it
Right.
becomes very critical, right?
Right, exactly. That's where the feedbacks which operate on time scales of decades or so are very important in these models, especially the strong ones that affect the surface energy balance for Earth.
Right, but that's got to be a very tricky business, is getting all those, figuring out what are those, the CO2, the water vapor, the methane, the soot. I mean, all these things, right, are going to...
Right, that's why people run models with different things changing in them and see how sensitive these models are to changes in concentration of CO2 or concentration of some other gas.
Right.
And it turns out that CO2 is a very important factor. So mostly because it's a gas which is long-lived in the atmosphere. It stays there without condensing. There's some annual cycle in the overall concentration, but it's not very significant compared to the trend. Sometimes people say, well, water vapor is much more potent greenhouse gas. Why we're not focusing on that? But it turns out that the CO2 concentration is what determines how much water vapor the atmosphere can hold. And there are modeling studies which suggest that if you remove all the CO2 from the atmosphere, it's not going to be able to hold much water vapor, and the Earth will plunge into ice age very fast, and it's not going to be orbitally forced.
Right.
So that's...
So that would make sense that if you have too much CO2, that it might kind of swing back the other way.
Right, yeah, exactly. But this is one of the reasons why you go out on these voyages, right, is to actually look at some of these issues more with the ocean, not the atmosphere so much, right?
Right.
But to begin to try to trace or find proxies for what's going on 1,000 meters down in the ocean, what's going on in that warm pool of water.
Not that deep. I mean, we're interested in upper 500 meters usually. So
Out here, the water doesn't mix down to that
not
deep
so
very
fast.
often.
It does
Yeah.
mix, but it takes,
takes
much
more
longer.
long, yeah.
But so we saw that ocean is a very important component of a climate system on this silly exoplanet example, and it's very important for El Nino, of course. The processes that happen in the ocean are very important. So what we're measuring is the rates of mixing of colder water with warmer water slightly above it in the ocean. So there are certain instruments that you can use to do that. And also models, simple models, which tell you what processes are likely to create this mixing in the first place. So that's what I'm interested in mostly on these cruises.
So I know in small bodies of water, like lakes, there's typically a very so-called thermocline, and you go down about 8 feet in the lake, and suddenly you notice there's just an abrupt shift of the water on the surface has been warmer, and suddenly 8 feet, 10 feet down, bang, you're in much colder water, and those two bodies of water stay somewhat separate, right?
Right, they don't mix very fast.
Right.
Right, they stay like this. And in lakes, you normally don't have very strong circulation, so you create this 8-meter deep surface layer due to wind mixing, probably. And the water below that does not really feel the wind very much, or there are some mixing events. But in the ocean, you see a similar picture. There's a mixed layer which is relatively well mixed, and below that there's a pretty sharp transition to different temperature, different salinity, etc. But the equatorial Pacific is very interesting because there are very strong currents there with a very small vertical, relatively small vertical scale. Such currents can produce mixing on their own in the ocean deeper than the mixed layer.
So again, more complications. So we're gonna get into those more complications when we come back for our third segment here. But we're gonna take a little break before that. Andrei Natarov and Elisha Wood Charlson are here from UH talking with me about climate models and climate variability and all that kind of good stuff. And I'm your host, Ethan Allen on Likeable Science. We'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week, we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
And you're back here on Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen, here on ThinkTech Hawaii. With me today in the ThinkTech studios are Elisha Wood Charlson and Andrei Natarov, and we are talking about climate models. And before the break, we were talking about measuring the temperatures at different layers of the ocean. And Andrei was just out on a cruise actually doing some of this stuff, and I believe we've got an image or two of the instruments that are in question here.
Right. I've been on a cruise aboard this wonderful ship, Falkor, which is run by the Schmid Ocean Institute. It's a very comfortable ship for living. And they have a great crew, which was very helpful in helping you fix instruments and stuff. So we had we've taken measurements using an instrument called Acoustic Doppler Current Profiler, which can measure currents with a high vertical resolution, about 2 meters.
Okay.
And if you go to the next slide, so this is this red instrument attached to the CTD frame. Here is the instrument I'm talking about. Basically, it's lowered with the CTD frame into the ocean. We went as deep as 500 meters on all casts during this cruise. And it sends the sound signal into the ocean. It scatters off different organisms and sends the sound bounces back. And you can determine what the velocity of water is using this instrument.
Oh, okay.
So, and if you do many of these profiles, you get a very nice picture of what the currents look like, the features, what's their kind of continuity in space and time, how long they persist, and how large they are in the horizontal direction.
Exactly right, because there are big currents that are deeper that we don't understand about, that we don't sort of see on the surface, and you have to use...
Right, you cannot really see them from satellites or anything. You have to really go and measure them.
But they're quite important in terms of moving
They may
around,
be,
moving
yes,
nutrients
well, the
around.
currents are definitely important in terms of moving heat around, but we are also interested in how much mixing occurs as these currents flow in opposite direction and communicate water between each other.
Absolutely.
So, and that's, the atmosphere is there at the top of the, waiting for a signal and temperature at the top of the ocean, and these currents might induce mixing of colder water with warmer water.
Exactly. So where is all this going? I mean, it sounds like these climate models have grown a great deal in recent decades. They've gotten better, sort of bigger, better, more complicated, probably harder to run, probably much more intensive as to computer time.
Right.
But what is the future going to bring here? I mean, are we going to be able eventually to say, hey, 3 years from now on January 3rd, it's going to be 75 degrees and raining?
Oh, no, not like that.
No.
Too bad.
Yeah. Well, there is intrinsic uncertainty,
Okay.
which has to do with really, even if you had a perfect model with almost perfect data, just this idea of chaos and dynamical systems, which, there is a limit of horizon of predictability over which you can predict certain things or not. And so that will never happen. But, other things may be predictable, or at least, so ideally what you want to see is understand why it's uncertain, why you cannot possibly predict it beyond that, and predict everything that is possible to predict.
Right.
So
Begin to put some bounds on the uncertainty too, right? And
Right.
be able to say, well, we're expecting maybe a cool winter this year. It won't be probably a very cold winter, but it won't be a warm winter either. It's going to, you'll be able to sort of get your predictions
Right,
tightened up a
or
bit.
explain why we cannot say
Right.
anything about it. That's also a result.
Sure.
And,
If you look at it and say the factors seem to be pointing in different directions here in this model.
Right.
And so
And
we
it's
don't,
a-
yeah,
it's
we
a-
don't, we don't know what's gonna,
Exactly.
who's gonna win here, right?
So a model is going to make a prediction, but it also needs to come with uncertainty assessment. Of
Right. Now, one of the big things I know on these climate models that people talk about a lot is this idea of spatial resolution, right? And just
Right.
because you say, yeah, the world might be getting 2 degrees warmer, that doesn't really tell you much about here in Honolulu versus Podunk, Idaho versus, Nairobi, Kenya. Right?
Exactly,
Those three
right.
places can have very different effects.
Right. So the global climate models that I used in IPCC reports are coarse resolution, so they not going to necessarily tell you what's going to be the climate like in certain regions. So there is a field of downscaling climate which is growing, but it remains to be seen whether there's enough societal demand for such processes, downscaling, or even a possibility, because there are a lot of other problems related to downscaling, larger scale models to regional scale. So,
And I would say locally, because modelers don't usually work with the biologists too much, but we're starting to do that a little bit. So we do a lot of our work in the Pacific Ocean just north of here, and we're trying to tie in the microbial activity. Like I was saying, they're producing a lot of oxygen, consuming carbon dioxide, and that right now isn't very good resolution in the localized models. And so we're trying to start communicating with our own internal science communication with modelers and try to incorporate some of those dynamic fluctuations caused by the biology in the ocean, as well as sort of the physical parameters of mixing and stuff. So.
Yeah, right. This is a whole, I think, a relatively new area, right, where it turns out the ocean microbes may actually be influencing some of these climate impacts in some perhaps significant way, right? Yeah, and that a few years ago, I think, was not really regarded with as much of a factor. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's become a big point of interest, and we actually have some funding from the Simons Foundation to start looking at that particular ecosystem and the effects that it might have on models.
Oh, that's very exciting. And so, what do you think is going to limit sort of that aspect of things, the crosstalk between the disciplines?
Oh, I think that becomes very much of a technical challenge in the sense of, the data that comes out of science, how do we make it, how do we basically translate the terms, the data terms or the data types into something that these guys can actually use? So, being able to actually track functional changes in nitrogen production, for example, and is there some way that we can actually give them information that allows that cycle to be incorporated in a model? So it's going to be a lot of data product communication that it's going to take us a little bit to figure out, but we're working on it. So,
Excellent,
yep.
excellent. And what do you see, Andrei, as then a real success in the business of modeling?
well, as I mentioned, I think the ultimate success would be to predict everything that is possible to predict, and to understand if something is impossible to predict, understand why, and quantify the uncertainty due to what factors contribute to this uncertainty. But it's
Do you see that happening anytime soon?
no,
Okay.
but the models are going to improve, and at least I think we will understand the processes that control, the climate and things better.
Right, but isn't there some of this phenomena going on that sort of it's sort of the more we know that we don't know, right? So as we uncover a factor that we think, oh, this makes some impact on things, we sort of open up sort of Pandora's boxes.
But
of
those
stuff.
unknowns come in at a different scale, so to speak. Hopefully, whatever we discover we don't know does not affect what we already known about the larger scale
Okay,
things.
so you think this is going to be increasing
Right.
on small
So
scale
the
stuff?
problem's going to get maybe more interesting, but more on a smaller scale.
Okay.
The more of the localized regional models that
Right.
he was talking about. So, a lot of the interest is sort of these global models because it does affect everybody. But yeah, it is going to come down to the fact how interested are people on sort of those localized, smaller scale models because, like you said, the accuracy in Podunk, Idaho versus here is going to be completely different.
Right, and people have sort of different needs and different interests in these different locales. And yeah, again, the people sailing across the ocean care rather about different aspects than the farmer in the cornfield, right? So, yeah. So, how would you urge, if this whole field of modeling seems like a very important aspect, but it's something that I don't think gets taught a lot, right? I mean, you don't typically have a science course on modeling per se. How would you urge students, and at what level would you urge students to start thinking about modeling, and how would you suggest they be engaged?
As soon as they understand any math whatsoever, just to connect math to real life problems, that's already a model.
Okay.
And introduce the concept of uncertainty early on. I think it's very useful, and so that people don't have expectations that models are going to predict everything. And so right now, children are very good at programming at a very early age, and they can write their own models at a very early age. So I think like as soon as they acquire any computing skills, modeling should be introduced into curriculum.
And just some of this code, the learn to code stuff.
Yes, instead of writing apps,
Right.
write models.
There you go.
Okay.
We need more global modelers. Well, it's nice also because, you know, as a scientist, one of the common misconceptions oftentimes is the difference between causality and correlation. And so models, I think, definitely really drive that home a lot of times, where you change something somewhere else and something else changes. And you can't actually say that that was a causal link, that, you know, A equals B. It could be that A did something and B did something, but there's another variable that changed that caused both of them. And so one of the common ones, I think, comes out of this analogy where, you know, the sale of ice cream goes up in the summer and the murder rate goes up in the summer. And obviously, more ice cream is not deadly. Right. So, I mean, that's sort of like one of the fundamental things that people use as an example. But I think when people get more invested in modeling earlier on, they start to understand those relationships a bit better.
Right, because models allow you to test that when you think, oh, does the ice cream cause the murders? You can run a dozen scenarios and you see, no, it doesn't work that way.
I think it's a challenge to write a model that models the effect of ice cream on murder rate.
But then, like you said, they're testing it, right?
Right.
So then it reinforces the scientific process.
Right, no, that's excellent.
Yeah.
And again, models should reinforce other science skills, right, about observation and deduction and inference, because, well, my model sort of keeps showing this, but I really see the other out in the real world, and therefore, you
Time
can't
to
ignore the
change
real
your
world.
hypothesis.
Yeah, time to tweak your model a little bit to make it better, right?
Yeah.
Right.
You know, and it's nice because, you know, kids are starting to program more often, and really they just need a computer, which a lot of, you know, we're fortunate that a lot of people a lot of children in our country have access to that. And so it's an easy way for them to potentially do that without having to buy more expensive gear and go out on a fancy boat, so.
Right. Indeed. But
you grow up to that, right? You gotta earn your keep to get on the fancy boat.
well, excellent. This is very exciting. So. Then your advice to students would also be sort of the same. It would be sort of get your hands wet with models early on, play with as many different kinds of models as you can, learn to make them yourself, learn to test them, learn to
start playing with science. I mean, that's how you get interested.
It's interesting, right? I mean, it's like a nice toy which you can tweak and see like what falls apart.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, maybe somebody will design an app for playing with the general circulation models.
Such do exist. They're written by adults usually.
Oh, right. For adults, probably. Yeah, okay.
Well, this has been very, very interesting here. It's been very informative for me. I love, by the by, your beautifully simple diagrams, Andrei. I think, again, there's nice, simple models that we can all learn from, and they're very, very valuable, I think, for educational tools and help reinforce the value of that. I thank you both for being here and helping me clarify this issue. And I'm sort of surprised no one asked us about the string of storms that we're getting and what this has to do with climate modeling. But we're out of time, so we couldn't answer that anyhow.
Right.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you, Elisha. And I hope you'll come back and join us next week on Likeable Science here on ThinkTech Hawaii.